Thank you so much, Sara, for joining us on the We Need to Act podcast. It is a great honor to share this space with you and to also welcome your knowledge. And for those who are listening and who don't know you and your work, you are the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, representing an Inuit across Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Russia. Can you tell us what your work looks like day to day?
Well, we are an organization that is founded in 1977. We were an organization that reunited Inuit living across these 4 different nation states. And we work for, first and foremost, to be the Inuit voice on international matters, everything that relates to speaking on behalf of Inuit in the UN, for example, or in the work we do in the Arctic Council. Our work day to day includes a lot of coordination and preparations for different international processes that we take part of. We have accreditation to the UN, and we also are co-founder of the Arctic Council. We currently also hold a new permanent consultative status in the International Maritime Organization. We are observers to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we have a number of staff and leadership who attend different international meetings year round. And we are very often very busy traveling or preparing for different international meetings where we want our influence to happen, and also for decisions that are taken about us to not be taken without us.
That's so important. And for how long have you been doing it?
So I'm chair in the term from 2022 to 26. So right now we are approaching the end of my term as ICC chair. And it's just, an honor of my lifetime to serve Inuit as chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council.
It is an honor for us to have you here. And you have said that Inuit and Indigenous peoples don't see themselves as separate from nature. And we have seen that as humans, we, in the past 200 years, we have separated ourselves so much from nature. And what we are seeing right now happening with the environmental crisis is a result of the lack of relationship with nature. How does this perspective shape your approach to protecting the environment and your work?
Well, first and foremost, as Inuit, we have lived and thrived in the Arctic for time immemorial, for thousands of years. And we've been able to do so exactly because we see ourselves as part of the ecosystem. What we do with and to nature is, also affects us directly as peoples. And that's very, very obvious for us as Inuit, both in former times, but also today, where many Inuit families continue to rely on sustaining themselves from hunting and fishing, where our economies are built on also fisheries, for example, here in Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland, where subsistence whaling is a big thing and big issue for Inuit in both Alaska and Canada and Chukotka, where we see that attention to the Arctic has also over time included attention from environmentalists on one side, trying to delimit our access to the resources, living resources, for example, or also attention to the Arctic, including industrial activities that might harm our access to these resources. So for us, it's extremely important that all government and management, international management and international government of our region happens with us at the table to make sure that the decisions that are taken do not harm our rights. We've seen it happen before, that our rights have been harmed by international institutions taking decisions that have consequences to us. So for us, it's extremely important that all the regulation and management and, agreements that are made about our environment and nature takes the approach that everything you do in that regime actually directly affects the people of that region. And we are a people of the Arctic region. We are also a marine people. We live along the coast for many, many Inuit. So it's extremely important that we are part of the discussions and the decision making when it comes to managing the resources and also shipping routes and so on in the Arctic.
Definitely. So it is really important what you've just highlighted. And we have welcomed to this podcast several Indigenous leaders from different regions. And it's so important to open the space for this discussion. And they have this close relationship with nature. What can we learn from the Inuit relationship with nature?
I think first and foremost, exactly the approach that when you regulate something in nature, it has human consequences. It can also have consequences to the human rights of a people of that nature. So you cannot separate, and it's extremely important that in your approach to nature, you don't separate humans from nature. When we look at the ice, others see desert, but we see infrastructure. We see hunting grounds. We see a path to walk on to get from A to B. So for us, pictures of ice are not just empty pictures. They are actually pictures of what is very we have an intimate relationship to the nature around us. And that is important to understand. I think especially because the Arctic is often portrayed as if it is, for example, an ice desert. And it's not. We live here, and yes, we may not be very many, but we have relations to the nature around us for a very big area. This includes the whole of Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland. It includes the homelands of Inuit across Canada, Alaska, and Chukotka as well. Those generational, knowledges that we have built about our region and about our nature is something that we have a very close relationship to as human beings who live in this region. And I think that approach is very often lacking in the way that the international community is drawing up agreements and doing different kinds of regulation and management of resources and nature, especially in the Arctic region. So, for that same reason, it is extremely important for us to be at the table at these international different fora and platforms where decisions are taken about the Arctic, or even just discussions are taking place about the Arctic. Very often we see that those discussions can be very disconnected from our reality. Therefore, I also see this in terms of us contributing to processes and decision making in ways that enriches those processes, and in ways that you would have a weaker solution if you have not included Inuit at the table.
That's right. And you've mentioned two things that are limiting your approach, your ways of living, which are connected to first the environmentalists that aim to protect the Arctic, and then the capitalists that are looking for resources, because as we know, the Arctic is a really rich region and is also changing fast. We see sea ice is shifting, new shipment routes are opening, and resource extraction is on the rise. And you are originally from Greenland, and well, we have seen this all this discussion lately around Greenland and this dispute, this new form of imperialism and colonialism. How do you navigate these international disputes surrounding Greenlandic territory, particularly when they affect your culture, society, and ways of life, as we mentioned? And how are Greenlanders also perceiving these renewed imperial interests?
I can see when I look around the media here in Nuuk, and I'm in Nuuk right now in Greenland, the big majority of the people of Greenland are saying no thank you to the US, and also calling on the respect and upholding the international rules-based order, recognizing our right of self-determination, our process as a self-governing nation, a people pursuant to international law, recognized as such through law. I think that the message from the people of Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland, has been very clear. And we are seeing the attention. I mean, we at our office have had to lock the door because media are entering our office. And I think it's the same for many in Nuuk right now, especially because media are here in big numbers from all over the world. I think that the government of Greenland has replied in very good ways and consistently that we uphold and assert our right of self-determination. And I also think that they have made it very clear that the current situation is that Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And if the US is in any way going to attempt or take steps to take Greenland by force or coercion, it would not be compliant with international rules-based order. And there would be a very big problem for the whole democratic world that a NATO ally would do something to another NATO ally. So it is a worrying time, but I think that the reply and the position of the people of Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland is very clear, and it has been repeated time and time again by the government of Greenland.
Thank you for clarifying this. And does this new imperialistic approach from the U.S. surfaces wounds from the past regarding colonialization?
Well, I think that if you look at the history of Inuit here in Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland, and also Inuit other places, we do have a history of having been colonized, and there is already a process of working, on first of all uncovering the consequences of colonization, working government to government to deal with those issues. That's the case for Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland in their relationship with Denmark. There are inquiries about the consequences of different programs, of the historical relationship between Greenland and Denmark. And there's been a process, especially in the latest years, to put more attention to how do we understand the colonial history. And all of those things were already going on before the attention re-emerged from the US. And I think that is important to remember. And I think it's important to compartmentalize those things. On one hand, a geopolitical interest by a international great power reacting towards other great powers, which we of course also are acutely aware of our region's importance towards. And then on the other hand, the process that we have internally in the Kingdom of Denmark between Greenland and Denmark in dealing with the very difficult questions and the consequences that came from colonization. That process, especially the last process that I'm mentioning, is a process that is so important to us as a people because it is affecting so many people directly. This is about our well being. This is about living a dignified life. It is about making sure that generations that come after us do not have to carry the burden and the trauma of having been colonized. And that is an extremely important process that I think it is extremely important to understand in its own right and don't not mix it up with the geopolitical interest that we are seeing. Unfortunately, we've seen that it has been mixed up also by, the rhetorics used sometimes from the US's side. And I really call on having respect for those processes that our people are conducting ourselves to enlighten and understand what does it mean to have been colonized. And that is a process that requires respect and also requires to stand in its own right.
For sure. Do you feel that the work that has been done towards that, the respect and that understanding of what was previously done to the Greenlanders is on the right path?
Well, I hope so, because one thing that we've also tried to make clear from the Inuit Circumpolar Council already last year, a year ago, when this interest from the US re-emerged, is that there's simply no such thing as a better colonizer. And we are very aware of that from our people. We have already been colonized, so we can recognize when somebody comes to us with an imperialistic or superiority approach based on sort of an old-fashioned view of how the world is, how the and how peoples are. I think it's important to say that most people here in Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland, can see through that and very clearly do say through media that we do not wish to be colonized again. And we want, a dignified dialogue and respect for our own dialogue about our own future. So I think the replies from the people here have been very clear. And it's important to remember that, times have changed since the world was working in a way where indigenous peoples and their lands could just be bought and sold. We are above and beyond those times. And now we base our cooperation on international rules-based order where we are recognized and have rights. So it's important to continue calling for everyone to abide by international rules.
That's it. For sure. Thank you. And you said once, nothing about us without us. And you have been mentioning during this interview the importance of bringing Inuit people to the table and to the discussions. Why are Inuit and Indigenous perspectives crucial to addressing today's challenges, and why must they be at the center of the dialogue on climate change and biodiversity loss in general?
Well, first of all, I think in terms of climate change and biodiversity degradation, we are at the forefront and we are adversely affected by climate change and biodiversity degradation and pollution. And at the same time, most of and generally speaking, we are not the ones who have caused climate change and the massive pollution that is ending up in the Arctic. So this is clearly a human rights issue, and it's an issue that can only be solved. Those are issues that can only be solved through international multilateral cooperation. And that's why we engage in, for example, the climate negotiations, or in we push for conventions and agreements to limit mercury pollution or plastics pollution and so forth. So it is important, I think, to understand that in the Arctic, we are seeing a kind of a sink process, that a lot of pollution that happens other places in the world are taken by the currents and the weather systems into the Arctic, and thereby entering the animals that we live from. So, for example, at some point in history, Inuit were among the peoples of the world who had the highest concentration of mercury in our bodies. So it's very obvious that much of this pollution that is happening other places in the world is actually entering our bodies through the food that we eat. So for us, it's absolutely fundamental to work through the international society and push for strong agreements to mitigate climate change, to mitigate pollution, to prevent biodiversity degradation, to prevent the fall down of ecosystems. And we are at a point of time where all of these things are happening in a rapid pace. The Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. And we are seeing, fortunately, that some agreements have actually had effect. For example, the Minamata Convention to prevent mercury pollution has had a positive effect. So we have to continue believing in this multilateral system actually having an effect. And it's of big concern to me to see that many big states are retracting from this multilateral system and engaging less and less. We really need everyone around the table to take part, both because, of course, for us, it is about our own well being, but also because pollution and climate change and biodiversity and ecosystems have no borders. This affects the whole world, and you have to be able to work together across state borders to ensure that our planet, stays healthy and comes back to a healthy state.
That's right. And that leads me to the next question, which is regarding, you mentioned the importance of multilateralism and these multilateral organizations and agreements, which have been so important. But we know that governments and these international institutions like United Nations have been losing influence over corporations. And in general, people are losing faith in politicians and in these international organizations. What actions are most effective, and where should we focus to keep hope alive?
I think that many corporations, especially big international corporations, are also realizing that it will have a big negative economic effect if we, for example, reach tipping points in terms of climate change. If we reach situations where things are simply falling down, for all of us. And I think that we are seeing more and more businesses. We've seen also processes that link business development, economic development to human rights. And we've seen how they have been increasingly supported. I was very honored to be part of the UN Secretary General's panel on critical energy transition minerals last year, and we drew up a report that was handed over to the UN Secretary General, who also handed it over to the UN system. And we have seen how many states, also producer states in terms of minerals, were also interested in making sure that this regulation actually becomes stronger. And the first and foremost and biggest principle that was included in this report was human rights, that we need to take a human rights approach to these kinds of developments, to transition into other energy sources, which I think many states recognize is necessary. So I think that there are, big portions of the system that still functions because there are many states who see the seriousness or the serious state we are in as a global society, and also many states who actually are ready to engage in processes to rectify things and identify how we can work together to ensure that we have regulation that also puts human rights at the forefront. I think there are some processes that are full function, but of course I also want to convey the concern I have that some of the big states are leaving those processes because we need everybody at the table. And in the end, their people, their citizens, will also be adversely affected and are already adversely affected by, for example, climate change or pollution.
That's right. But the action has been slow regarding climate actions. And also we know that even the United Nations and Antonio Guterres said recently that humanity has missed the 1.5 climate target, and which will have, as we know, severe consequences for the Arctic and its people and the rest of the world, as you well mentioned. What measures have been taken or can be taken to reduce the vulnerability and increase resilience for Inuit communities?
Yes, and there's a big issue also related to this, which is that the international community has decided to establish different forms of climate finance mechanisms. But most of those mechanisms are actually not accessible to Arctic indigenous peoples because they are set up to address mostly, events in the global south and support so-called developing countries. So we've been very clear from the Inuit Circumpolar Council, together with the indigenous peoples from all over the world, in calling for the climate finance mechanisms to be accessible to all indigenous peoples, also us who live in the Arctic. If we look at the Alaskan coast, so Alaska as part of the US also faces very serious risks from climate change. So we have seen how the coastal areas are eroding due to permafrost thaw and also more extreme weather events. We have seen how two big towns on the western Alaskan coast were evacuated this fall. 1,000 inhabitants were moved to the city centers because their towns were flooded. So huge, huge challenges are also very real to a state like the US because there are approximately 30 communities that are at risk of relocating because of climate change along the Alaskan coast. We've seen the breakdown of the salmon population in certain rivers, also in Alaska and in Canada, also in some of the Nordic countries. We've seen how permafrost thaw is severely damaging different infrastructure. And here in Kalaallit Nunaat, for example, that the fact that the ice is less stable and less safe is also taking away the ability to sustain families parts of the year when we have a year with very bad sea ice. So these are consequences that are very real and that are very tangible for those people who live in the Arctic, including Inuit. And I think that this really also amplifies the need for states to act and also continue being committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And therefore, I fully also agree with the concerns expressed by the UN Secretary General. Hopefully, we will see in the coming years that people will stay at the table and will continue to engage in a global move towards a better path. I think that, of course, the COP30 results does pose some concern to us, but it wasn't all negative. I mean, there was also an ability of states, and states demonstrated the ability and political willingness to actually engage in negotiations. And that gives me some hope for the upcoming climate negotiations in the years to come.
Thank you so much. And what will happen to the Arctic people if their ecosystem collapse and is connected to their ways of living and cultural identity?
Well, I think it's important to remember that having already been colonized, these threats are also severe. There's already been a situation where a lot of the traditional and indigenous ways of living and being have been diminished by colonization. So this really adds pressure to that. But at the same time, Inuit have always been extremely good at adapting and have been able to survive in the Arctic for millennia for that exact reason. So I think although we are all acutely aware of the effects and consequences of climate change, there's also a lot of work being done to address how to adapt and ensure that we can continue not just surviving, but thriving here in the Arctic. And that's something that is being addressed and worked on both through a government level, but also in the communities. But it's important to never forget the link between global climate action and the rights of indigenous peoples. You can not separate those two things. Therefore, we are just also very, very happy that we stand together as a global indigenous peoples caucus in the climate negotiations and work in a very unified way to address these challenges as indigenous peoples. And that also gives me some hope. So I think it's important to recognize that you cannot talk about climate change without also talking about the human rights of those who are most adversely affected.
Yes, the vulnerable ones, the populations that are most impacted by climate change as indigenous peoples. And this has been a really enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And do you have any final message you would like to leave with our listeners about hope, the future, something
No,
little?
not so much, other than I hope that people around the world will take the time and spend a little time learning about us who live in the Arctic, and that there are actually peoples in the Arctic. It's not an ice desert, and we are here and we've been here for millennia. We've been building our own self-government agreements. We are working, especially from Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland, on so many levels as part of the global, society. We are quite globalized peoples. We know a lot about what is going on in the rest of the world. And I think it would be nice if the rest of the world also knows more about us. It's been interesting to see over the past year how, especially mainstream media from all over the world, buys the premise that we could be bought and sold. So I hope that in the way that people speak about Kalaallit Nunaat Greenland, that we will end the whole sort of narrative of us being something that you can buy or sell. We cannot be bought or sold. We are a people and we are a nation. And the Arctic is inhabited by many peoples and nations. And we should continue working together based on dialogue and based on diplomacy and upholding our promise to maintain peace and security in the Arctic.
Thank you so much for your wise words and for ending this conversation with such an empowering message. It was a great honor to have you with us.
Thank you, Bojana.